The National Archives is the official archive of the UK Government and England and Wales. We are home to the nation's stories and are the guardians of some of the world's most iconic historical documents, from Doomsday to Downing Street tweets. We believe that archives are for everyone because they are about everyone, past, present and future.
Hello, and welcome to What's Online, a regular series of online talks from the National Archives. My name is Philippa Hellawell. I'm a collections specialist here at the National Archives, and I'll be facilitating today's talk. Before we get started, I just have some quick housekeeping. The event will last approximately 1 hour, finishing at 3 p.m. UK time. If you have any technical queries, please email our team at whatson@nationalarchives.gov.uk and they will try and assist you. You can make use of live captioning throughout the talk. This can be enabled by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your screen. Today, I'm delighted to be introducing my colleague Jessica Nelson, who is Head of Collections Expertise and Engagement here at the National Archives. Appropriately for Halloween, Jessica will be exploring witch beliefs and witch hunts through the lens of original documents from the National Archives collection. There will be some time for audience questions at the end, so please do submit those using the Q&A button at the side of your screen. Over to you, Jessica.
Thanks, Philippa. Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining today. It's Halloween, so it's the perfect day to be talking about witches and witchcraft, but I'm going to be exploring the actual evidence for witchcraft, witch beliefs and witch hunts in the records of the National Archives. The evidence that I'm going to be sharing today comes mostly from the early modern period, so that's the centuries when the Tudors and the Stuarts ruled England and Wales. And actually, I'm mostly going to be talking about the Stuart kings and that sort of period of history, so that sort of slightly later early modern period. I'm going to be talking mostly about England because that's the country for which we have the most evidence of witch beliefs in our records. And I'll just point out before I get started that I'm going to be looking at actual evidence, at actual cases. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about today is quite grim, fascinating, but quite grim. And I'll be quoting from records that can be quite disturbing. So I just wanted to kind of give you the heads up about that. So to get into the talk today, beliefs around witches and witchcraft have existed for millennia. Witches feature in Greek and Roman literature, for example, but for hundreds of years, witchcraft did not appear to be particularly bothersome. During the medieval period in England, witchcraft and sorcery were forbidden by the church, and cases of witchcraft do appear in the records of the church courts. But most witchcraft had a practical, helpful bent. People sought assistance from witches to heal sickness, to charm potential lovers, or to recover lost or stolen goods. And on the whole, the secular authorities, so the non-church authorities, were willing to overlook it. In the 16th century, however, towards the end of the 16th century, the situation began to change with the introduction of legislation that made witchcraft a secular crime, that is, a crime tried in the common law courts, not in the church courts. This means that we start holding more records relating to witchcraft at the National Archives because we hold the records of the central law courts, including the assize courts, which were the forerunners of the modern Crown courts, where most cases of witchcraft were tried. Our first key date is the establishment of witchcraft as a major secular concern is 1563, when the government of Elizabeth I passed a Witchcraft Act re-establishing witchcraft as a felony. And this act was bolstered by James VI and I in 1604. And I should have a little picture here of what that, so 1603, 1604, that period, that year of James's reign, and that's what the Witchcraft Act looks like. For anyone who's familiar with the history of witchcraft might kind of prick up their ears at the mention of James VI and I. This king's youthful enthusiasm for witch hunting has rather tainted his modern reputation, and he even wrote a book on it, Demonology, in 1597, before he became King of England. By the time he did become King of England in 1603, James's enthusiasm for persecuting witches had lessened, but nonetheless, this act against conjuration, witchcraft, and dealing with evil and wicked spirits clearly defined witchcraft and provided a legal framework for punishing perpetrators. The act had a tight focus on the association of witchcraft with the devil, talking specifically about conjuring or invoking any evil and wicked spirit, and also a focus on witchcraft being used for harm. As a secular crime, witchcraft was potentially punishable by hanging. We might assume that from this point on, witchcraft was considered such a heinous crime that in effect it was a death sentence for anyone accused of it. In fact, our records show that the truth is rather more complicated. This is not to belittle the horror of the hundreds of people, mostly women, who were hanged for witchcraft and whose accusations of witchcraft could potentially ruin their lives. But not everyone who was accused was found guilty, and not everyone who was found guilty was hanged. And I'm just going to talk about some of the cases that feature in our records, which show different experiences that people had when they became caught up in accusations of witchcraft. The first case I want to tell you about is that of Joan Guppy. Joan's case was heard in the infamous Court of Star Chamber. This court had many functions, including acting as a civil court where people could launch actions against each other. So not necessarily somewhere where you would expect to find a case relating to witchcraft. But Joan had petitioned the court for redress because she claimed she had been violently attacked by a group of neighbours whilst on her way to the market in Crewkerne in Somerset in June 1605. Joan's bill of complaint was made jointly with her husband because women could not launch an action in court without their husband's involvement. And in her bill of complaint, which we can see on the screen here, she states that 4 of her neighbours had pulled her from her horse and assaulted your said subject and did with pins prick your said subject, and took the great overgrown bramble and drew them about her face, saying that she was a witch and that they came for her blood. Joan claimed to have been fearful for her good name and indeed for her life. And this bill is accompanied by various other documents which tell the story from the side of the defendants, who were 2 sisters, their brother, and another local man, who, to be honest, seems to have really been a bit of a bystander. What emerges from all of these documents is a fascinating story of witch beliefs within an early modern community. Judith Gibbs, one of the sisters accused, freely admits in her evidence that she attacked Joan, but she goes into a lengthy explanation of the reasons. She claimed that she had been unwell for several years, and medical practitioners, unable to help her, had suggested that Judith's illness might have unnatural causes. So then she turned to her neighbour, Joan Guppy, for help. Joan had a reputation for curing people who were bewitched, selling them powders to lift the spells that had been put upon them. And Judith notes that Joan had made a great deal of money from this, from ignorant country people. However, Joan refused to help Judith, which made Judith start to think that perhaps Joan herself was responsible for the bewitchment. She says that she weighed up the evidence. Joan did not go to church much. She couldn't recite the Lord's Prayer. And Judith could recall occasions on which people who had fallen out with Joan suffered misfortune shortly thereafter. Received opinion in the countryside, we see this a lot in the records, was that pricking a witch, drawing her blood, was an appropriate means to lift an enchantment. So Judith enlisted her sister and brother and prepared to intercept Joan on the way to market and scratch her with a pin. Judith admitted in her evidence that things did get a little out of hand, although she blamed Joan for hitting out at them with her riding crop and really starting the fight. But Judith also insisted that after the incident, she had started to feel better, while Joan had fallen ill. Judith was unrepentant. She argued that this minor disturbance was hardly worthy of the court's time, and further, she stated that Joan exhibited the hallmarks of a witch, recorded by the king himself in his demonology. While Judith stood firm, others within the community had very different views about Joan, and in fact a large number of members of the community actually signed a certificate stating that Joan was not a witch, and that's the document we can see on screen here. So we've got Judith and her brother and sister on one hand, but then a lot of people from the community coming together saying that Joan isn't a witch. Unfortunately, we don't know the outcome of the Star Chamber case. It may be that the case was dropped before it proceeded to judgment, which happened with a lot of cases in Star Chamber. But we have the will of Thomas Guppy, Joan's husband, who died in 1626. And from that will, we can see that at the time of his death, he and Joan were still living in the same village, along with their 2 daughters, Anne and Mary, who had both been born in the years after the court case. The case of Joan Guppy was clearly very complex. Judith Gibbs was not an ignorant woman making wild accusations. She was familiar with the king's own writings on the subject of witchcraft, and she had considered the evidence before herself deciding to act. When she did act, she enlisted her siblings and took matters into her own hands, rather than reporting Joan to the local justice of the peace. Perhaps she was wary of the costs of taking a case to court, but perhaps she was also aware that many of her neighbours would disagree with her view of Joan, as we know that they did. Were it not for Joan's own decision to seek legal redress after her assault by Judith and her compatriots, it's possible that this case would never have resulted in any legal proceedings, we wouldn't have known about it, and it wouldn't have become known outside the local area. Not so the case that I want to look at next, which took place about 30 years after the attack on Joan and hundreds of miles away in Lancashire. We first hear about this case in a letter that survives from Sir William Pelham to his brother-in-law, Edward Viscount Conway. On 16th of May 1634, Sir William wrote rather gleefully, "The greatest news from the country is of a huge pack of witches which are lately discovered in Lancashire, whereof it is said 19 are condemned, and there are at least 60 already discovered, and yet daily there are more revealed." It's little wonder that the appearance of witches in Lancashire was the proverbial talk of the town. In the previous generation, a witch scare in Pendle, very nearby in the same county, had led to the deaths by hanging of 10 people, and the clerk of the court had written and published a detailed account of the proceedings, which had disseminated the story across the kingdom. We know from this pamphlet that this earlier trial was largely fueled by accusations and counter-accusations made between and within two families. And the evidence at the trial of 9-year-old Jeanette Device did much to condemn to death her own mother and older brother and sister. But what happened in this second Pendle witch scare? By the time Sir William Conway wrote to his brother-in-law in May 1634, the trial had already taken place, and what we know of the initial events comes mostly from a pamphlet written by John Webster, who was a highly sceptical local curate. He wrote that in November 1633, a young boy, Edmund Robinson, had started telling stories about people within his community being witches and making accusations against them. His father started taking the boy from church to church, where little Edmund pointed out ever more witches, and by that means got a good living. By February of the following year, 1634, the accusations had come to the attention of local magistrates, who took the statements of Edmund Robinson and his father. Once the formal investigation was underway, more people came forward with accusations, resulting in a large number of women and a few men being sent to trial at the Lancashire Assizes. Of these, around 19 were found guilty. The witches swiftly became the talk of the kingdom, but the judge at the assizes was not satisfied with the evidence, and despite the guilty verdict, he granted the witches a reprieve and referred the matter to the Privy Council, which is the small group of senior politicians who were at the heart of early modern government. As a result, on the 16th of May, the same day that Conway wrote with such excitement to his brother-in-law, the registers of the Privy Council, which are held at the National Archives, note that writs of habeas corpus should be issued so that the principal and most notorious offenders in this case should be brought to London to appear before the Privy Council. And you can see down at the bottom there is the list of the principal and most notorious offenders as they're described. Margaret Johnson, who's called the Penitent Witch, John Spencer and Mary his daughter, Jeanette Hargreave, Alice Higgin, Frances Dickinson and Jeanette Lloyd. A couple of weeks later, on the 31st of May, the registers show that a note was sent to the Bishop of Chester requiring him to call those persons before him, examine them and send examinations to the council. And a further note was sent to another official to tell him to visit the house of Edmund Robinson Sr. and take into his charge his son, Edmund Robinson Jr., that discovered the witches, and escort the latter to the council as well. On the 15th of June, John Bridgeman, the Bishop of Chester, reported back to the Privy Council. Bridgeman was an experienced and serious churchman, considered to be a safe pair of hands, probably not someone to easily believe in accusations of witchcraft, perhaps particularly from a small boy. His letter begins by reporting back to the Privy Council that of the 7 people he'd been asked to examine, 3 had already died in jail, and a 4th was laid sick past hope of recovery. I'm going to ignore that doorbell. Apologies if you can hear that at home. He goes on to say that he has examined the remaining 3, and he talks first about the old woman called Margaret Johnson, alias the Penitent Witch, and describes how she willingly and tearfully confessed, often acknowledging that she was a witch, but more often faulting in the particulars and circumstances of her actions, as one having a strong imagination of the former, but also of too mean a memory to retain or relate the other. Turning to the 2 remaining women, he outlines his belief that their neighbours were taking the opportunity to maliciously take revenge on them, and he shares the deposition of another local woman, backed up by others, who told him that Edmund Robinson Sr. had asked for 40 shillings from Frances Dickinson, one of the accused, in order not to testify against her. Having provided this context to his recipients, Bridgman then enclosed copies of the examinations themselves, and they make fascinating, if horrifying, reading, and take us as close as we can get to the voices of the women caught up in these appalling events. Of course, their voices are still being mediated by Bridgman, who's writing it down, but I think it's as close as we can get to what they were saying themselves. First of all, Margaret Johnson, who was called the penitent witch. The bishop had already told his readers that Margaret was old, upset, and confused, and her examination makes for uncomfortable reading. She began by saying that she hath been a witch about 6 years last past, and that she was brought thereto upon some troubles and vexations of her bad neighbours. And about that time, walking in the highway, there appeared to her a man in black attire, who said to her if she should give him her soul, she would want nothing, but should have power to hurt whom she wants, both man and beast. But she refused, and this man vanished. But she says he approached her again and again, until finally she gave in. He gave her into her hand some silver and gold, as she thought, but it vanished as soon again, and she knoweth not how, for she was ever bare and poor, though he oft gave her the like. And she saith that most commonly at his coming to her, he hath the use of her body, and she had some lust and pleasure thereby. And after this he appeared to her in other shapes, sometimes as a brown-coloured dog, sometimes as a white cat, and at other times like a hare. And as those shapes he did suck her blood at 2 dugs or paps in her privy parts. But despite clearly considering herself to be a witch, if we believe the evidence that she's giving us, Johnson went on to say that she never hurt man or woman by witchcraft, except perhaps one man, and even there she seems confused on the details. Further, Johnson had no intention of incriminating any of the people who'd been accused alongside her. She says that of those people condemned with her, most of them were previously unknown to her, and she also states that lots of those imprisoned with her daily pray and read the Psalms and appear to be godly folk, before adding that she herself did diligently frequent the church till her foul compact with the devil, but from then she seldom went to any church. Johnson's tale has many of the hallmarks of these early modern witch scares. She's an elderly widow, she's in a vulnerable position socially and economically, she's poor. In terms of the witchcraft itself, her story of meeting a man dressed in black, of his transformation into various familiars, all of them relatively common animals, and of physical intimacy with these familiars, are all tropes which are found again and again in accusations of witchcraft, shaped by the popular demonologies and pamphlets describing previous witch scares. The examination even handily gives us the term compact with the devil, which is potentially something that which Bishop Bridgman has put in there from his knowledge of the kind of structures and underlying beliefs about witchcraft, rather than necessarily something that Margaret has said herself. The other 2 examinations are equally illuminating, although very different in tone. Mary Spencer, who's aged about 20, gave a stout and spirited defence of herself, utterly denying that she had any knowledge of witchcraft or that she'd hurt anybody thereby. And instead, she turned the attention to her neighbour, Nicholas Cunliffe, who she said had borne malice to her and her parents for several years and thus had wrongfully accused them. Cunliffe had apparently said that her pail, her bucket, used to come running to her of its own accord upon her call because she had bewitched it. Spencer provides the simple explanation that when she was a girl and sent to get water from the well, she sometimes used to run down the hill, rolling her pail down the hill behind her and calling to it, a childish amusement which is obviously very far from witchcraft. She also explains that she would have answered for herself at the last assizes, but the wind was so loud and the throng so great as she could not hear the evidence against her. This is itself a fascinating insight into the extent to which the frenzied atmosphere of the court could influence the outcome of the case. But Spencer has no problems defending herself to the bishop. She continues with an account of how she used to attend church at Burnley every Sunday and used to repeat the prayers and preaching to her parents at home. And to drive home the point that she's a good Christian, Spencer recited the Creed and the Lord's Prayer to the Lord Bishop. And the record of her examination ends with the statement that she is not afraid of death, for she hopes it will make for her an entrance into heaven. Next up is Frances Dickinson. Like Spencer, she utterly denied the charges and went on to claim that the boy who accused her hath much wronged her out of malice, as she believes. She proceeds to explain that there was a disagreement between Edmund Robinson Sr. and her husband over the purchase of a cow, and that he hath ever since maligned her and her husband. She then stated that she'd also had a disagreement with another accuser over the purchase of butter. Most damningly, she lastly claimed that Edmund Robinson Sr. had promised via a named intermediary that if her husband paid him 40 shillings, neither he nor his son would say anything against her. So, Bridgman, the bishop, did what was required of him and submitted these examinations to the Privy Council. Shortly afterwards, the council took the step of appointing a group of surgeons, including the King's own physician, Dr. William Harvey, to assemble a group of midwives and together examine the bodies of the women and report on what they found. The group was to look for physical marks that might be considered evidence of witchcraft, specifically evidence that familiars had sucked blood from the women's bodies. And the women were taken to the Surgeons' Hall in Mugwell Street in London for examination. And this is the report of the surgeons and midwives that survives in the state papers. It states that on the bodies of Jeanette Hargreaves, Frances Dickinson, and Mary Spencer, nothing unnatural, neither in their cervix or any other parts of their bodies, nothing like a teat or mark, nor any sign that any further things hath ever been. And note that Jeanette Hargreaves, who Bishop Bridgman had reported to be at death's door, wasn't spared this incredibly intrusive and traumatic physical examination. Of Margaret Johnson, it states that they did find 2 marks in the private parts of her body as she had herself described, but there was nothing terribly odd about them, and they certainly didn't produce blood or give any sign that familiars had been suckling on them. Faced with these conflicting testimonies and with no physical evidence, the councillors sent the Chief Justice of Middlesex, George Long, to interview Edmund Robinson, the young boy upon whose claims this entire edifice was built. Edmund rehearsed his original accusation to Justice Long, which centred around him witnessing 2 dogs that he had tied up turning into people, and then one of them turning into a white horse, and him riding this white horse into Pendle Forest, where he witnessed a great gathering of 60 witches. But he then admitted to Justice Long that it was all false and feigned and a mere fiction of his own. And why had he done this? The age-old reason for a child to lie to get out of trouble. He says, he was appointed one time to fetch home his mother's kine, her cattle, but did not do it, and went to play with other children, and being come home and fearing lest his father or mother would beat him for neglecting to bring home the kine, he made this tale for an excuse, and for no other end or purpose. But then, as can so often happen, he enjoyed the attention that the tales got him. Afterwards, perceiving that many folks gave care unto him and believed him in that he spoke, he grew confident in it more and more. Edmund's tales clearly took on a life of their own, and as we have seen, other local people came forward to accuse these women. Edmund's explanation makes it clear that his story played off various tensions already at work within the community. Firstly, he said that he had heard tales about the first Pendle witch scare, and he reused some of the details, but adapting the locations of the gathering of witches from the first scare to a place that he knew locally. It's quite clever. Secondly, he says that he had heard his neighbours gossip maliciously about other neighbours, so he used some of those details too, and he reels off a great list of neighbours who he had heard muttering accusations against each other. And namely, he hath heard one Edmund Stevenson say that he was very troubled with the said Dickinson his wife in this time of sickness, and he suspected her. And he had heard Robert Smith, another neighbour, say that his wife, lying upon her deathbed, did accuse Jeanette Hargreaves to be the cause of her death. And he has heard William Nutter, his wife, say that Jeanette Device and William Device had bewitched her. And it was so reported by those neighbours that had watched with her in her sickness. And it was generally spoken that Bevis, his wife, who went begging, was commonly taken for a witch. And he had heard John Smith say that the wife of John Loynd had laid hands upon a cow of his, after which she never rose. And just as an aside, the eagle-eyed amongst you may have noticed in the boy's evidence the mention of the name Jeanette Device. Although Jeanette was not one of the women taken to London for examination, she was one of those originally accused. And this is probably the same Jeanette Device who was the star witness as a child at the witch trials earlier in the century, where she gave evidence against her own family. So it may be that she already had the taint of witchcraft, which might have made these stories from this child all the more believable. Further, one of the justices charged with the initial investigation into Edmund Robinson's stories, so this is before it came to the attention of the Privy Council, was a man called John Starkey. As a child, Starkey, with his sister, had started having fits, leading his father to believe that the children were possessed by the devil. This possession had eventually led to a man being executed for witchcraft. So if Starkey believed that he himself had been a victim of witchcraft, it seems perhaps more likely that he would be more likely to believe the accusations of Robinson and his fellows against people a generation later. Edmund Robinson was only 10 years old and can hardly be blamed for what happened in the months after he first came up with his tall tales. The last we hear from him in the state papers is that he saith he is very sorry for that he hath said. I bet he was. Although he claimed he had made it all up himself, by July, Edmund Robinson Sr., his father, had been imprisoned in Westminster, and we also have 2 short reports of examinations from him taken in July, in which he asserted that he never believed his son's tales and that the investigation of them was entirely driven by officials in Lancashire. He also utterly denied the accusations that he had attempted to extort money from anyone to change his evidence. There is no happy ending. In July 1636, 2 years after these examinations took place, 10 of those accused were still in prison in Lancaster, including Jeanette Hargreaves, Mary Spencer, and Francis Dickinson. There's no mention of Margaret Johnson, the penitent witch. She was an old lady, and perhaps she had died in the meantime. No reason is given for their continued imprisonment, and it may be that the Privy Council, while willing to uphold their reprieve from the sentence of death, was not willing to completely overturn their convictions. The judicial scepticism, or the beginnings of it, in 1630s Lancashire seems to offer a glimmer of hope in terms of people becoming more sceptical about witchcraft and witch beliefs. But across the county border in Yorkshire, we have another case involving a young accuser some 40 years later, where equally flimsy evidence is taken equally seriously. In this case, which took place in Denbigh, a 16-year-old woman named Mary Moore made accusations against 3 of her neighbours, Susan Hinchcliffe, and her husband Joseph, and their married daughter, Anne Shillitoe. Mary's first deposition dates from the 24th of August and claims to be a report of a conversation overheard earlier in August between Susanna and her daughter Anne. The 2 women were talking about a family called the Haigs and discussing, so said Mary Moore, the damage that they could do to the family. Susanna apparently said, "Wilt thou not go today and make hay at Thomas Haig's? If thou canst but bring 9 bits of bread away and 9 bits of butter in thy mouth, we shall have power enough to take the life of their goods. They need not be in such pomp, for we will never leave him cow nor horse at house." Anne then asks Susanna if she does harm to Dame Haig, and Susanna says that she has by touching the cadgings of her skirt. The conversation goes on in this vein. They talk about taking the lives of 2 pigs and also of hurting a child. Then some weeks later, on the 2nd of October, Mary gives another deposition in which she recalls another conversation that took place in mid-July. Her powers of recall are very impressive. In this one, she reports that she heard a conversation between Susanna and Anne in which they talked about Joseph Hinchcliffe, who's Susanna's husband and Anne's father, and how he was able to cause harm to people that wronged him. And Susanna says, "Thy father went to John Walker's to steam a pair of shoes and he would not let him have them without he had money in his hand, but he never made pair after. Likewise, he went to George Copley's to steam a waistcoat cloth, and he would not let him have it without he had silver in hand. He never made peace at after but 2. So to steam is to obtain goods on credit. In other words, these 2 craftsmen would not let Anne's father purchase goods that they had made on credit, and as a result, because they wouldn't let him buy those things on credit, he rendered them unable to work." Susanna added that if anybody would not let them have what they wanted, they could take the life of anybody. We can see then that Susanna, Joseph, and Anne are being accused of attacking people who are just a little more affluent than themselves, people who they might be expected to resent, people who might perhaps feel a little guilty about the way they've treated people who are a bit further down the social scale. The only further evidence that survives in this case are 2 short depositions from other members of the community, both of whom testify to have seen Mary Moore vomit crooked pins and pieces of bended wire. There's no further context about them, so they're rather baffling, and my supposition is that Mary had perhaps claimed that Susanna and Anne had bewitched her, and vomiting ironmongery was the result. But alongside these depositions, we do have a remarkable certificate in which over 40 neighbours strongly defend Anne and Susanna against Mary's accusations. They state that they have known Susanna and Anne for many years, and know Susanna to be not only very sober, orderly, and unblameable in every respect, but also of good example and very helpful and useful in the neighbourhood, according to her poor ability. We have never heard or had the least ground to suspect her or her said daughter to be in any sort guilty of so foul a crime." And turning then from Susanna and Anne to Mary Moore, the young woman who made the accusation, These neighbours go on to say in this certificate that they fully believe that the said information against them is both a most gross and groundless, if not malicious, prosecution. And as touching the said girl who now informs, some of us could say much concerning her of a quite different nature, but that we judge recrimination to be an indirect way of clearing the innocent. So this large group of neighbours is willing to go on record to state not only are Susanna and Anne innocent of all crimes, but that Mary is making a malicious prosecution. The surviving assize records do not record the outcome of the case, but a biography of a famous Yorkshire preacher records that Susanna and Joseph Hinchcliffe were both accused and bound over to appear at the next assizes to answer the charge. The biography notes that Joseph Hinchcliffe could not bear it and hanged himself on the morning of the 4th of February 1675, and in the meantime Susanna too died, praying for those who had falsely accused her. By the end of the 17th century, scepticism around witch beliefs was growing, including amongst the judiciary, and both the number of cases of witchcraft coming before the courts and the number of guilty verdicts was in gradual decline. However, even the most doubtful judges might fail to intervene when public opinion was strong or when political motivations muddied the waters, as we see in the case of the last 3 women that we know to have been hanged for witchcraft in England: Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards. These 3 women were accused of witchcraft in Bideford in Devon in 1682, with various of their neighbours providing the usual flimsy evidence against them. One of the 2 circuit judges, the Lord Chief Justice Francis North, wrote to the Secretary of State Sir Leoline Jenkins, expressing his reservations about the case. North had not in fact been the judge at the trial. He had left that grim task to his fellow judge, Sir Thomas Raymond, so he describes the scene through Raymond's eyes. And North writes, "Here have been 3 old women condemned for witchcraft. They were the most old, decrepit, despicable, miserable creatures that ever he saw. A painter would have chosen them out of the whole country for figures of that kind to have drawn by. The evidence against them was very full and fanciful, but their own confessions exceeded it. They appeared not only weary of their lives, but to have a great skill to convict themselves. Their descriptions of the sucking devils with saucer eyes were so natural that the jury could not choose but believe them. I find the country so fully possessed against them that though some of the virtuosi may think these things the effects of confederacy, melancholy, or delusion, yet we cannot reprieve them without appearing to deny the very being of witches, which, as it is contrary to the law, so I think would be ill for his Majesty's service, for it may give the faction occasion to set afoot the old trade of witch-finding that cost many innocent persons their lives, which this justice will prevent." So North, then, claims to be concerned that if the townsfolk felt that they had been denied justice, it could lead people into taking the law into their own hands and potentially to self-appointed witch-finders. He is dryly willing to sacrifice the few, these 3 women, for the perceived good of the many. And this document records the fates of inmates in the local jail. And here are the names, and it's the last 3, sort of the 3 names in the middle. They have the abbreviation SUS on the left-hand side in the margin, as long as with that rather elaborate star shape. And the SUS stands for suspendator, let her be hanged, or let him be hanged. So that's how we know for sure that Temperance Lloyd, Mary Trembles, and Susanna Edwards were hanged for their perceived crime of witchcraft. And as I say, these are the last women that we know to have been hanged in England for that crime. North's letter makes the point that while witchcraft remained contrary to the law, it would be difficult to avoid prosecutions and therefore indeed guilty verdicts. The natural result of the growing scepticism of those that North termed the virtuosi was the Witchcraft Act of 1735. This act repealed all the previous witchcraft acts and introduced new laws which reversed the previous legal position. Instead of the practice of witchcraft being punishable, the crime was now the pretense of witchcraft. In essence, anyone pretending to be a witch or to have magical powers would be considered a con artist. Of course, the fact that the government and judiciary no longer officially believed in witchcraft did not mean that witch beliefs disappeared overnight. And in the records of the Home Office, we have a criminal petition from June 1827, so nearly 100 years after the Witchcraft Act was overturned. Criminal petitions were petitions made to the Home Office by convicted persons or by their supporters, seeking to have the convicted person's sentence revoked or reduced. So this was in a time before there was a court of appeal, so people petitioned directly to the Home Office. This petition related to a group of men in Monmouth in Wales who had been convicted of riot and assault for attacking an elderly woman named Mary Nichols. They believed that the woman, Mary, had bewitched cattle belonging to one of the men, William Watkins, who was a farmer, causing several of those cattle to die. Watkins had been sentenced to 6 months imprisonment for his assault on Mary and his fellows to 3 months each. There are a great many signatories to the petition. You can see them there at the bottom of the slide, I hope, asking for leniency, pleading that the men were all of good character and that Watkins had already paid £20 in compensation to his elderly victim. But also within the file, is a letter from William Powell, who is the vicar of Abergavenny and the acting magistrate. And he's actually writing to the Home Office to ask that the petition be refused, to ask that these men aren't granted any leniency. And that's the little pop-out that you can see there. He explains that the local people almost universally believe in sorcery, conjuring, witchcraft, and all manner of devildom. And he's actually underlined the word devildom, so I hope you can spot it there on the left-hand side. And that if the sentences are reduced, they will be confirmed in their miserable absurdities and be led to fancy that even in more enlightened minds, some leaning may exist in favour of their ridiculous but mischievous superstitions. In other words, people would take a reduction of the sentences to be tacit approval by the elites of their beliefs in witchcraft. As the vicar hoped and as he asked, the petition was indeed refused. So as in the case of Sir Francis North's lack of intervention in the case of the 3 Bideford witches, one can see that the outcome of the trial is influenced by circumstances well beyond the simple facts of the case. There's a lot more going on here. There are many more instances of witch beliefs and witch trials in the records of the National Archives, but I hope that I've given you a bit of a snapshot here of the real stories behind the myths. We can see some of those familiar tropes of witchcraft, black cats, sucking devils, potions and spells. But we can also see the human beings behind these tropes, the ordinary people, usually women, often elderly, very often poor, who are accused of these terrible crimes and who in tragically large numbers paid the ultimate price for the folly of their times. Thank you for listening, and happy Halloween. And I've also just got here, if you're interested, just a list of other some really good books on the subject. There's a huge number of books on the subject of witchcraft, and these are some really good ones that give which kind of give surveys. So there's a huge literature on it, but those are some ones that I've found particularly enjoyable and useful. And there's also a suggestion of a podcast at the bottom there. So just if you want to go a little bit further with it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jessica. That was excellent. And I can definitely recommend James Sharp's books. I had the good fortune to be taught by him when I was at the University of York. And so I was introduced to the world of witchcraft via his wisdom. And there's still so much to learn. You know, I've learned so much from your talk, and it's wonderful to see how it is represented in the state record, and how we're still able to get an insight into the dynamics of local communities, even through official legal and state records. I have so many questions for you, but I'm going to kind of defer to the audience first. Riley has a question, which you kind of touched on this at end about where we see the kind of decline in belief, but we perhaps shouldn't see that as such a steep drop. But Riley asks that we see witch accusations were quite common across European history in this time. When and why did witch accusations cease, and why did witch concerns come out of practice?
Yeah, I mean, that's almost a whole talk in itself. So I'll try and give some sort of broad outlines. I mean, in effect, accusations really die away at the beginning of the 18th century. So by the time the Witchcraft Act is kind of replaced by this new act in 1735, by that point there are very, very few trials for witchcraft taking place. So in that sense, that legislation sort of slightly lagged behind judicial practice. So what we see is, that a new Witchcraft Act is put into place towards the end of Elizabeth I's reign, and from that point onwards, so late 16th century, there's a kind of increase in accusations of witchcraft. Then it sort of it hits a kind of peak around maybe sort of 1620, 1630s, it starts to die away. It pops up again in England, partly due to very simply the activities of Matthew Hopkins and John Stern, who kind of double-handedly were responsible for hundreds of accusations, and so they sort of create a new peak towards the end of the 17th century, and then they go into decline again. And as I say, then the legislation is brought in. So after that, there can be no more accusations of witchcraft because it is no longer a crime. In terms of why people sort of cease to believe in witchcraft, I mean, there are so many, there's so much to this, really. I think in terms of the elite, so we see from the beginning there is a degree of skepticism fairly early on. That not everyone is taking these things entirely seriously. They certainly no one would have denied the existence of the devil, but you certainly get the elites being relatively skeptical about whether the devil would genuinely be choosing to work through these kind of poor, decrepit, miserable old women. If the devil was really going to kind of make a pact with a member of society, why would they go for somebody in such a pathetic social position, to be perfectly honest? So there is a kind of degree of skepticism from quite early on. And then over the course of the century, we see a growth in what we now would call science. They called it natural philosophy. The Royal Society gets a charter from Charles II in 1662. So kind of those sorts of scientific practices are getting much more of a firm grounding. After the restoration of Charles II as well, I think that sort of religious fanaticism generally is being pushed to the side by the elites. That's being seen as something that's rather common, to be too kind of fanatical about anything. So I think that's an aspect of as well. And there becomes more of a divide between kind of elite culture and popular culture. And witchcraft and witch beliefs is more something that they do, that the plebs do almost. And once the elites changing their minds and the judiciary are changing their minds, then it's less and less likely that those accusations will come to fruition and less likely to get to court. And as I say, eventually they change the law. In terms of popular practice, as I say, and as I've shown in that last case, there are certainly, it seems that witch beliefs kind of hung on well into the 19th century. And that's, as I say, that's almost a talk in itself, talking about the kind of the decline of those sorts of beliefs in more isolated communities. But as I say, you could talk about this for a long time, but I hope that's kind of got it in a bit of a nutshell.
No, that's great. And it kind of makes sense why we see it disappear from records at the National Archives, because if Absolutely. The judiciary and the state administrators are less, if they believe kind of less in the phenomenon of witchcraft, then we don't have the record that exemplifies it, and it's
Exactly.
something that exists in local communities. We have a few questions about the drowning of witches and the practice of swimming. I wondered if you could say a little bit about that, and if we have any records of that, and also the kind of sad misfortune of women who drowned but were innocent when they were put through this practice.
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question, because this image of women being kind of swam, which for anyone at home who's not familiar, was this idea that they would be kind of dunked in water, and basically if they drowned they were innocent, and if they survived they were guilty and were then executed anyway. This is a real kind of part of our modern mythology around witchcraft. And swimming, I'm pleased to say, actually wasn't something that was ever kind of the norm in England. Torture wasn't admissible in the assize courts process. There were certainly practices that we might consider torture, but formally torture was generally not allowed. And in terms of the court process, the swimming of witches simply didn't happen. I'm not sure I've ever seen anything to suggest that in part of the court process swimming happened. Where it did happen, and there were occasions of it in this country, it was more basically the kind of the mob justice, where potentially before a case had come to trial, or maybe it never did come to trial, or wasn't going to get to trial, a community had decided to take action into their own hands, and therefore did this horrific practice of effectively drowning somebody, in the guise that this was a kind of sort of religious way of ascertaining whether she was a witch or not. But it certainly wasn't part of normal practice in this country, and it didn't happen. I don't think it happened a great deal. And where, for example, I've seen a letter in the records of the Navy Board from 1675, where somebody is writing and they've heard about a woman being drowned as part of one of this sort of swimming process that's been carried out by a mob. And they say that a piece of such cruelty that I've rarely heard of it. So this was not something that was the norm. I think it was more normal in other parts of Europe, but I'm not the expert on that, so I wouldn't want to comment on that. But we shouldn't see, certainly in England and Wales, we shouldn't see that sort of swimming was something that happened on an everyday basis. And there also were cases where communities carried out swimming and women were drowned. And then the people who were the ringleaders were then tried for murder. So there's at least one case, I think more, where a woman is drowned because she's allegedly a witch, and then somebody is executed for murder. So I mean, it's never a happy ending, to be honest, with these cases. But yes, swimming was not kind of the norm. Which, as I say, isn't to say that these women were treated well as part of the judicial procedures. You know, the conditions in the prisons, the interrogations, they would have been terrifying. They would have been desperate. But no, swimming was not part of practice here.
Thank you, Jessica. There's quite a few questions which are interested in your own engagement and response to the records, like certain stories or items that you found most surprising or the most upsetting. I don't know if you've got any kind of personal reflections on some of the records that you've looked at.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of the records are very upsetting. You know, particularly I found reading the records of the examinations in the case that I talked about in Lancashire, in Pendle, and the interrogation or the examination of Margaret Johnson, who is this woman, the penitent witch. And she seems to confess very freely. She's talking about all these things that she's done. The bishop is clearly skeptical. And, he writes that, she's very old, she's very poor. She talks, and I find it really heartbreaking, this idea that the devil was giving her money, but she was still poor because it wasn't proper money and the money disappeared. So she wasn't getting anything out of this at all. And I think, the likelihood is that in this day and age, we would probably consider, she's probably got she's perhaps got Alzheimer's or dementia or something like that. She's very ill. She's very confused. She's very old. And she's been dragged to the assizes. She's been in jail for months. Then she's dragged to London. She's talking to this bishop. Like, the idea that this old woman would be like having a conversation with a bishop, the whole thing must have been absolutely terrifying. And it is, these are not fun records to deal with, but I think they're wonderful because they really take us into early modern communities at kind of at ground level. Most of the accusations are coming from relatively poor people against people who are even poorer. There are exceptions to that, but most of them are people quite low down the social scale. So really, it's through court records that we actually get to hear about what's going on in these communities. So even though the stories are quite grim and quite disturbing, and there's definitely been moments when I've, had to kind of stop and walk away and take a moment, absolutely, definitely. And I think that goes for lots of people working with archival records, that you do have to kind of look after yourself as well. But I really think it's worthwhile, not because witchcraft is exciting and there's sorcery and magic and broomsticks, but because we actually hear about ordinary people and what they're doing and the way their communities work.
Absolutely. And I think there's an important distinction to be made there about the kind of historical phenomenon of witches and witchcraft and the kind of the image of witches and witchcraft we get in popular culture. And of course, that's inspired by the historical record, but also, like you say, there's a real history of inequality there with the sorts of women who were accused of witchcraft, and the fact that it was women as well. Like you talked about, these surgical and medical examinations of women's bodies, and it very much is, the persecution of certain types of women. And you did mention, I think, one man who was executed for witchcraft in your talk. I wondered, could you say a bit more about, was it just women? Were men also probed? Were accusations of witchcraft or wizardry posed to them? And if it is, it seems to be majority women, why is that the case?
Yeah, I mean, another great question. The vast majority of the accused were women, and probably a higher proportion in England as opposed to Europe, is my understanding. So from the records that we have, and the records are not complete, the evidence isn't complete, but from the evidence that we have, it seems like in England, probably 90%-ish of people accused of witchcraft were women. And that perhaps was a slightly lower proportion in continental Europe. Why? Again, lots of reasons. Partly, I think, because women were seen as a weaker sex, a more vulnerable sex, more kind of more susceptible to sexual advances. So certainly when these ideas come in, and they're in some ways they're quite elite ideas about the devil approaching women in a sexual way, that was something that women were going to be much more perceived to be much more susceptible to. So there's those sorts of theoretical things around women being weaker, women being more susceptible sexually. But then there's also very practical things. Women were more likely to be poor. If a woman didn't have a protector, that left her in a very vulnerable position. So lots of the women, I mean, we as I mentioned in the talk, some of the women that we've talked about today were married, so they did have protectors. But lots of the accused women tended to be poor. They were unmarried. Perhaps they were widows. They didn't have those protectors, so that perhaps they were going a begging. They were having to rely on other people's charity. That made them vulnerable. Women also were very involved in childcare and much more likely than men to be looking after children, including other people's children. And we didn't particularly come out in any of the cases I've talked about today, but lots of accusations of witchcraft come from children who've been taken ill. And it being about, well, this woman was caring for my child and then the child wasn't getting any better, or the child died, or some other awful thing befell. And that kind of thing was just naturally more likely to happen to women, because women were more likely to be looking after children, and also probably more likely to be looking after people kind of on their sick beds. Although in terms of, I know that there's again thinking around kind of cunning folk, and to what extent witches had in a kind of previous generation were just what we would consider to be cunning folk, who were kind of almost, basically medical practitioners after a fashion. And I should just say that men were cunning folk as well. So that wasn't exclusively women. So it's not just that, but that kind of plays into it as well, I think.
Thank you, Jessica. Leah has a question that is slightly related to this. She's from Lowestoft, where they have a local history of witches and witchcraft, Amy Denny and Rose Cullender. There's lots of evidence against older women and little against the younger. Was witchcraft commonly used to get rid of unwanted people?
I mean, that is a brilliant question. And I think sometimes sort of yes. And I think a lot has been written really interestingly about the kind of the dynamics and the community tensions, and whether or not there's a lot of population increase in this period. There's more people, there's a really big increase in population, which hasn't really been seen before. And that leads to more poverty and more social stratification. So in individual kind of, I mean, obviously this is a big generalization, it differs across the country, but what you're seeing in a lot of villages is there's the kind of the slightly more sort of yeoman class, who are a little bit better off, the farmers, and then there's the people who are a bit worse off. So like the Hinchcliffes and the Shillitoes we talked about, who are having to buy things on credit, they're having to go to Farmer Haig's and make hay for him. So even though all these people, we would consider them poor and they were not high up the social scale, there is still a bit of a difference between them. And some of the things that historians have talked about is whether there's an element of people kind of being asked for charity and refusing it, and then feeling guilty that they've said no, and then there's a kind of mutual resentment going on, and whether that sort of mutual resentment makes this kind of these kind of tensions and accusations more likely. And I think so I don't think it wouldn't necessarily have been conscious, as in there's this annoying old woman, I'm going to accuse her of being a witch to get rid of her. I mean, that is a nuclear option. I'm not saying it never happened, but that is that would be a very strong thing to do, given that it can easily result in somebody being hanged. But certainly I think that is potentially underlying, that these are people who are a bit of maybe a burden on the community, and that might be kind of playing into it. But having said that, you do also see younger women being accused, and as I say, you do see married women being accused. So we can't kind of pick out one thing and say this is why. We always just have to look at the factors and individual cases and try and come up with sort of more general themes, but also allowing for the fact there is always going to be exceptions and different things going on in different areas.
Thank you, Jessica. Charles also mentions that midwives often got accused. How prevalent was this? And is there something that we can learn about the fact that midwives were often associated with witchcraft? Maybe it's something to do with, like you said, the association with child rearing.
Yeah, again, I think it's the same sort of thing. If a woman is a midwife, she's there at a time when both mother and child are extremely vulnerable. In this period, the dangers of bearing children, both to the mother and to the child, were huge, so much greater than they are now, thank goodness. So that's obviously a time when people are falling ill. And again, it's these sort of crisis points a woman is a midwife. When things go well, that's a cause for celebration. When things go badly, potentially you're kind of thrashing around for somebody to blame. And it might, if it happens on several occasions, then perhaps some sort of accusation will come out of it. But again, it's not the case that all midwives were accused of witches, or that all accused witches were midwives. It's just another one of these associations.
Yeah. Brilliant, thank you. You've so many questions coming in, Jessica. I'm trying to fit in as many as possible.
We'll have to do we'll have to do a rerun next Halloween.
We will, yeah. Some about witnesses in court. First of all, about children being witnesses in court, and did witnesses receive money to appear in court? So I suppose there's something there about the kind of credibility of testimony, and why were things like children's testimony taken so seriously?
That's such an interesting question, because this was a time when children generally were not taken particularly seriously. And generally speaking, on the whole, the credibility of women and the credibility of children in the early modern court process was not great. But yet, with accusations of witchcraft, they do get taken much more seriously. And I wonder there if there's a bit of a kind of vicious circle, in that they're more likely to take children seriously. So like we see with little Edmund, he starts talking about witchcraft and everyone wants to know. And before that, he's just some 10-year-old who gets beaten by his parents if he's not looking after the cows. And all of a sudden, when he makes these accusations, everyone wants to talk to him, and he's getting to talk to these important people, and this is exciting. So I wonder if there's sort of something, there's, as I say, a bit of a kind of circle there, that the more that they're taken seriously, the more likely they are to come forward. Therefore they're more taken seriously. In terms of whether they were paid to appear in court, I actually don't know the answer to that question. You might know, Philippa, and so do say if you do. I would say not as far as I know. But at the same time, I think there can be something exciting about kind of getting your day in court and getting to, people kind of inserting themselves into the action. And where you see these, these kind of pile-ons, almost, we might call them now, where more and more people are coming forward with accusations, I wonder if there is that thing about, everyone wants to it's a big event and everyone wants to be involved. But yeah, again, a great question, and another kind of thing that is a really kind of multifaceted answer, really.
I think there's there's something about the whole legal machinery of this, isn't it? Yeah. About how it works in court, and this is where our records are particularly insightful. And we've got quite a few questions about the archival records. Wayne asked the question: is it possible for members of the public to examine these documents in person? The question is yes. Yeah.
No, it absolutely is. A lot of the records I've talked about are from the assizes. That's where the kind of the higher law courts. They're not the easiest records. You will have seen that from the slides, but absolutely, we welcome members of the public to kind of come and investigate, but also do bear in mind your local archives, where the quarter sessions were held. So the quarter sessions that were held locally, they're like the lower law courts. Their records will be held locally, and they're very likely to be accessible at local archives. So yeah, the more people that look at these records and use them and investigate and make up their own minds and come up with their own ideas, the better. Absolutely.
And you'd be welcome to join. We can put in the chat a link to registering for a reader's card. You just need to register for a reader's card, and you can come and look at the records that we have. There's just two connected questions that I'd like to just shoehorn in right at the end. First of all, it's about evidence beyond the records that we have at the National Archives, and also somebody's asked, could you give some recommendation about using archival research? Some tips, somebody who is currently undergoing a PhD and they've found this topic really relevant and very helpful. So maybe, if you could kind of give us a little bit of advice on using archival research, and also where we would go if we were to look outside the National Archives.
Yeah. So in terms of using archival research, I would always say go to the secondary sources first. So some of that suggested reading and other books, look at the things that they've looked at, look at their references. They're always a great starting point. They'll give you some clues. And always do your homework before you show up at an archive. Think about the sorts of things that you want to do. Make sure you've got, made some notes and that kind of thing. In terms of other sources, there's lots of pamphlets which were written at the time. They were really important, and they can be found. A lot of them are available online. Then they can be found at, as I say, at local archives and at kind of larger reference libraries, places like the British Library. So that's those pamphlets are another really good source, and also the demonologies that people were writing. Again, some of those can be found online, and there's kind of reprinted versions, and again at larger reference libraries. So yeah, really fascinating stuff.
Well, brilliant. So we're 1 minute away from 3:00. So I just want to take this minute to thank you, mainly Jessica. Thank you for sharing your research. It's been wonderful and very appropriate for the 31st of October. Thank you to our behind the scenes team who have helped with the smooth running of today's event, and also thanks to everybody at home for joining us. So this is it from us, and happy Halloween.
Happy Halloween.